Hello, bonjour, bienvenue, and welcome. In this video, I'll discuss formulas and cell references in more detail. To illustrate this lesson, let's consider an example that's very common in the sciences, where we need to make several different calculations on a series of data. In this case, let's consider a data set comprising a series of substrate concentrations and enzyme reaction rates measured in absorbance versus time at each of those concentrations. So in this spreadsheet, I have used the cell style preset of input to denote cells where a user would be expected to paste or to enter data. So the implication is that if you reuse the spreadsheet, you would only enter new values into these cells, into the input formatted cells, whereas the other cells are not to be overwritten as they contain either fixed text or values that are calculated according to a formula. So to convert the absorbance versus time rates in column C into concentration versus time rates in column D, we would need to divide every value in column C by the extinction coefficient of the reaction product, which we find here in cell C1. So in this case, that means dividing each of these values by the value 14,000. Now, we could create a formula that contains the explicit number 14,000 in each cell, that is, dividing this cell by 14,000, but that would mean we could only use the spreadsheet for that specific extinction coefficient. It would be hardwired into the formulas. And in contrast, my point of view for spreadsheets is to construct them as generally as possible, so you can use and reuse them as broadly as possible. So to illustrate this approach, we will write a formula to divide each absorbance versus time rate by the value in cell C1. And that way, if we ever want to reuse this spreadsheet with a different extinction coefficient, we can just change the value that we enter into cell C1. So in cell D4, we would enter the formula equals C4 divided by C1. And actually, since I'm reporting rates as millimolar per minute, that would have to be 1,000 times C4 divided by C1. Now, to copy this formula in each of the cells below it, we can simply click on the lower right corner of D4 and drag down to D16. So in doing so, Excel has changed the reference, each of the cell references in each of these cells, by incrementing them as we go down. C4 became C5, C1 became C2, etc., etc. And this is how Excel copies what is called a relative cell reference. But you can see that this was actually incorrect, because C1 should not have been changed in each cell. It should have been the same in each cell. We want to divide by C1 in each cell. So in this case, what we want C1 to be is called an absolute reference. So let's undo that drag fill, Control Z, and now let's do it correctly. So in cell D4, we can edit the formula, and we're going to leave C4 as a relative reference because we want that to change as we go down the column. But we're going to change C1 to be an absolute reference by adding a $sign in front of the 1. This tells Excel to keep the number 1, to keep row 1 in each cell as we drag it down. And there's a keyboard shortcut for changing a reference between absolute and relative, and it's very convenient. It's F4. So if I highlight reference C1 in the formula bar, and I tap F4, you can see that the reference changes to being absolute with respect to column, relative with respect to row and column, absolute with respect to row and column, and absolute with respect to row. And you can toggle between all four states really quickly. In this case, we want the reference to be absolute, at least with respect to row. Now when I drag fill the column, you can see that the formulas are updated correctly. In D5, I'm dividing D5 by C1. In D11, I'm dividing C11 by C1. The next two columns are relatively straightforward to complete. I simply want this cell in E4 to equal 1 divided by the concentration of substrate, which is found in B4. And now that I've entered it once in E4, I can select the lower right corner of the cell, drag it down to complete the formula, to complete the column. In F4, I want the formula to equal 1 divided by the rate in millimolar per minute, that's D4, and then I can drag fill the column as usual. But let me show you another useful shortcut. Instead of drag filling, I can move the cursor to the lower right corner and simply double click. And Excel will drag fill essentially all the way down the column. So insofar as there's data entered into the column to the left of it, that is down to E16, Excel will copy the formula all the way down to F16. So to complete the data treatment, we can now use these data to calculate the slope and intercepts of the data set, and use those values to calculate the Michaelis-Menten parameters. To do this, I use the slope formula equals slope, open bracket. Then I select the known y values, in this case 1 over v, comma, and I select the known x values, in this case 1 over s. Close bracket, return. If I want to report the slope to 3 decimal places, I can simply click here to increase the number of decimal places. Now I'm going to go back to this formula and edit it and make those references absolute by tapping F4. That changes nothing with respect to the slope, but it allows me to do another useful shortcut. Now, if I click and drag this cell down to F19, because the references were absolute, it's the same data set that's being used to calculate the slope again. So now I can simply edit the formula in F19 to say intercept instead of slope. This allows me to calculate the intercept without having to re-enter the range values. And in many cases, and especially for large data sets, it's probably faster to copy the absolute range and edit the formula as I did here, rather than reselecting the large range each time. So now with the slope and the y-intercept calculated, I can calculate the x-intercept as being the minus y-intercept divided by the slope. And from this Lineweaver-Burk data set, I can calculate Vmax as being the reciprocal of the y-intercept, and Km is the negative reciprocal of the x-intercept. And again, if I want to report these to 3 decimal places, I can simply go up to the menu bar and increase the number of decimal places we're reporting.